that is the state of the Big 12. Even more so, let's take inventory for 2022. I think very quietly, the Big 12 has been one of the most fascinating conferences to track with. And I've mentioned it in passing on different videos, but let's really take a deep dive into this. The Big 12 is in a major transition. Let's just call it what it is. 8 of the 10 schools either have a new head coach or a new quarterback. So at the most critical variables in your program, you have some newness. So ultimately, what is that? Whenever something's new, there's a question mark. Even if it's proven somewhere else, you still got to do it in a new environment. One of the schools that's not having to replace a head coach or replace a quarterback is Oklahoma State, and they're actually having to replace their defensive coordinator, who was leading, let's just call it what it was, the strong point of their team and how they were winning games last year. So there's even some uncertainty there. One of the other schools that isn't having to replace a quarterback or a head coach is Kansas. No disrespect to Kansas, but let's call a spade a spade. So ultimately, I think there's 2 scenarios that play themselves out when it comes to the Big 12 because of all of this transition. The first scenario is it's just gladiator style. Nobody's really a finished product yet. Nobody's really at their best. Everybody's vulnerable, and everybody just beats the heck out of each other. Like I said, it's just gladiator style. And nobody makes the playoff. Maybe the champion is a 2 to 3 loss team, and that's just how this thing rolls. The other scenario is the vacant throne scenario, meaning it's up for grabs. That seat is wide open at the top, and one program or maybe 2 programs put it together quicker than the others. Because when there's a lot of transition, it's like you're trying to put together some sort of Lego piece. You're trying to build a Lego car. Sometimes you're messing around with those pieces, seeing which fits here. But if a couple of teams can put it together quicker, well, then those are the 2 that, in my opinion, are in pole position to be successful and win the conference. So what I'm looking at most closely is 4 teams. Like I said, anybody could win this conference. That's the beauty of this conference this year and ultimately college football as it stands. You could make an argument for Kansas State because of what Adrian Martinez brings to the table. You could make an argument for West Virginia because of JT Daniels and be reunited with Graham Harrell. Those are all fair conversations, but to me, I think there's really 4 teams that we have to look at that have a legitimate shot at winning this conference. First and foremost, it's Oklahoma. Brent Venables, a first-time head coach, but with Jeff Lebby and Dylan Gabriel, you've heard me say it a million times, if they get synced up, which is ultimately the hardest part of getting a successful offense is the offensive coordinator and the quarterback being on the same page, with their history, if they can get synced up as an offense, meaning the receivers and Dylan Gabriel get synced up, the offensive line and Dylan Gabriel get synced up. If they can all be on the same page quicker, which is the easier part of this transformation, they have a chance to get out of the gate fast. Because I just have a sneaking suspicion that with Brent Venables' history and his resume on the defensive side of the ball, they're going to be able to make quick work over there. Schematically, I think that's going to be something that comes together sooner rather than later in the season. No pun intended. Next, I'm looking at Texas. For Texas, the defense has to figure it out. That is just a variable that has to come together for them. But when I look at the offensive side of the ball, I see a really high ceiling. I think Steve Sarkisian does as well, and that's the reason why he went with Quinn Ewers. And so what I'm looking at for Texas is, let's just say the defense does figure it out, or the defense is par for the course. They're average. If the offense can be as special as we're talking about them being, even more so if Quinn Ewers can live up to his billing, well, then Texas is going to have a chance to make a case for themselves in the Big 12 Conference. Because if you've watched this show, you know how highly we think of Quinn Ewers. At the same time, we understand there may be some growing pains. Can you minimize those growing pains? Can you trust the running game with Bijan Robinson, allow him to do the dirty work for you, and then have the other variables come together around Quinn Ewers to allow him to be successful early rather than later? Because if he can live up to his billing, if he can figure it out early, watch out. Because the way people talk about Quinn Ewers, you would think he is the second coming in Austin. That's how highly they think of him. So how quickly does that happen remains to be seen. I'm not necessarily going to pick Texas in this segment to win the Big 12. I've already picked who I think the winner is. But what it comes down to is Quinn Ewers that guy? If he is, good things are happening in Austin. Next, you got to look at the returning champions, the Baylor Bears. They said no to their quarterback who won them the Big 12 a season ago, more or less. He didn't start in the game, but he got them to the Big 12 title a season ago. And they said, hey, we're going to go with Blake Shapen. We're going to go with the better arm, the guy who we think gives us a better chance to win football games. And they lose a lot on defense. I will admit that. They lose a lot on defense. They also lose their stud running back from a year ago, Abram Smith. So they got some holes to fill. But they still bring back 7 guys on defense. They lost 2 guys to the NFL that are studs in Jalen Petrie and Terrell Bernard, but they still have a lot of those guys coming back on defense that were there a year ago, most notably on the defensive line. Ron Roberts is a wizard defensively. Dave Aranda is a wizard defensively. If they can be multiple on offense, if they can still be able to score points and the defense holds up at their end of the bargain, which sounds like a simple formula, but in Waco, that's kind of how they do things, simple and easy. If they can execute to the degree they did a year ago and have the more vertical passing game, Baylor's going to be a force. I'm just saying it right now. They're going to be a force in this conference. They're a team that I expect to very much so be in the race when it comes to late November. So that's Baylor for you. Now, this last team, I was tempted to leave out of the conversation. But to be truthful, I left them out of the conversation in 2021, and they played for the Big 12 title. Oklahoma State, like I mentioned, is one of those programs that does return a head coach, that does return a starting quarterback. You got Mike Gundy, a head coach, Spencer Sanders at quarterback, but they lose their defensive coordinator in Jim Knowles. And like we already talked about, this defense won a lot of games for them a season ago. It was one of the best in the country. And so to lose the guy who was calling the defense for you, I think is a gaping hole. But Mike Gundy's a great head coach. They got to be better offensively. That's all it comes down to for me. The defense is not going to be nearly as good as it was a year ago. Can Spencer Sanders take that next step in what will be his last year at Oklahoma State? Because last year he was 20-12 in terms of touchdowns to interceptions. That's not nearly good enough. He has to be a better passer, and he has to ultimately just will this offense to more points. I think Mike Gundy will be instrumental in that, but Oklahoma State needs to be better offensively regardless. You cannot count out the Cowboys because of the reasons I just mentioned. Returning head coach, returning quarterback, they just find ways to get it done. Very curious about that defense, though, so it remains to be seen what happens there. Hey y'all, thanks so much for watching. Subscribe to the channel here to make sure you don't miss an episode of The Hard Count. Also be sure to check out other videos on the On3 YouTube channel.